So good morning, everybody. I'm Denny Court. The annual Osterberg Memorial Lecture and Award was established by Fugro Load Test in conjunction with the DFI Educational Trust in honor of Dr. George Osterberg, one of the true pioneers of geotechnical engineering. The lecture and award recognize innovations in deep foundations related to engineering design, testing, or education, all aspects of Dr. Osterberg's lifelong contributions. Dr. Osterberg has long been recognized for his innovations in soil sampling and testing, most famously his inventions of the Osterberg sampler and the Osterberg cell. Dr. Osterberg enjoyed a long and distinguished career as a teacher and a consultant, culminating as a professor emeritus of civil engineering at Northwestern University. So for the past 12 years, the committee tasked with accepting and reviewing nominations of candidates for the award reviews carefully the contributions ascribed to the nominee and ultimately votes on the candidate who most strongly espouses the qualities associated with pioneering life's work of Dr. Osterberg. So past recipients read kind of like a who's who of geotechnical pioneers, including Clyde Baker, Bent Felinius, Dan Brown, Jean-Louis Briaud, Kyle Rollins, Frank Rausch, Dr. David Krapps, Richard Fino, Jack Hayes, and most recently Sam Pikowski. So this year the award is going to Dr. Eric Lohr in recognition of his considerable contribution to the profession in the spirit of those pioneering contributions of Dr. Osterberg. So Professor Lohr is the Logan Professor in the College of Engineering at the University of Missouri and a Senior Principal Engineer with Dan Brown Associates. He's over 25 years of experience conducting geotechnical engineering research, most recently including work to evaluate the benefits of post-grouting for drilled shafts with funding from the FHWA and Caltrans. He's authored or co-authored numerous publications, including most recent updates to FHWA's Geotechnical Engineering Circulars 5 and 10, and has contributed to the development of practical, reliability-based design provisions for several state departments of transportation and for AASHTO. He's active in professional organizations, including DFI, the ASCE Geo Institute, the International, this always cracks me up, International Association of Foundation Drilling, otherwise known as the ADSE, and the Transportation Research Board. He received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. So this is almost a homecoming, I guess, for you a bit. So with this, we'll add the 2021 Osterberg Memorial Lecture and Award to that list of distinctions. Congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That's for you.
No, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Very nice. Thank you, Denny. That list of previous award recipients is certainly a group of folks that I aspire to emulate. So it is certainly an honor to be selected to give this lecture, and I very much appreciate DFI and Fugro and Load Test for sponsoring the award and for giving me the opportunity to present. Here we go. Okay, so I think, actually I should say something about Dr. Osterberg. I didn't know him, obviously, but I did have the one chance to meet him at the ADSC faculty workshop about 20 years ago in Colorado, and he gave a little presentation and kind of hung out with us for the day, and he was just the nicest, most gracious person that I think you'd ever want to meet. And so it's certainly an honor to receive this award in his name. I also think it's, the contributions that he's made to our profession are really immense. I mean, it's hard to understate the value of that. And so what I hope to do today, and I think this is an appropriate topic, is to lecture about the considerable benefits of bidirectional loading. And I think probably at this point we've probably achieved the vision that he had with doing bidirectional load testing. That certainly doesn't mean that we don't have more benefit to gain from that. But I also think in recent years we've learned a little bit more about bidirectional loading, and that there are some other benefits that bidirectional loading can produce that I think can benefit our profession even more. And so I'll talk about really three different benefits. That's intentionally plural. One of which I think will be pretty straightforward and everybody will agree to. The other ones are a little bit more forward-looking, or at least current-looking ways that we can account for and utilize bidirectional loading to do that. I wanted to start with some acknowledgements here. I could honestly spend the entire time allotted just thanking companies and funding agencies and people, and I won't do that. But what I'm going to present is really a combination of results from a number of different research projects that have been funded by different agencies. These projects don't get done alone, and so it takes lots of companies, drilling contractors, material suppliers, collaborators from other universities and other things. And so I want to make sure that recognize them and hope they know that I appreciate those inputs very much. The same could be true of people and dozens of colleagues and collaborators and students and others, and I won't go into that list, but I do want to mention three that have had a particularly important influence on and contribution to the work that I'm going to be presented. One of those is actually Bill Ryan with Load Test, who has been involved in every load testing project I've ever done, and I certainly rely heavily on his expertise and appreciate his contributions very much. Second one is Peggy Haggerty Duffy from ADSC, who helps to coordinate all of the logistics between university folks and contractors and site access and material suppliers and all those things. And she really is a resource that helps us to get these kinds of things done. The third I'll mention is Andy Bachman, who's a former student at the University of Missouri and a research engineer, and now with Dan Brown and Associates. He certainly had a significant contribution to the work that I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to talk about three benefits, and so that'll give you a little bit of perspective on this. I'm not going to spend too much time on the first one because I think it's the more obvious one, and I think everybody would probably agree to it. The benefit of bidirectional loading has really been improved knowledge, and this really comes about because the Osterberg cell made load testing more economical. If you look back at the literature in the 1970s, kind of predating the O-cell, what we now call bidirectional load testing. We did do load tests, but when we did those load tests, they were oftentimes on relatively small size foundations, certainly not usually full size foundations, often in cases where the loading was relatively light. And the advent and the sort of adoption of using bidirectional testing, I think, really dramatically expanded the frequency with which we could do load testing and the projects where it became viable. So no longer did you have to do a load test only on a project that was a big river crossing bridge or a large structure. Now you could actually do load testing on relatively routine projects and do that cost effectively and gain advantage from that. And so just that alone really dramatically expanded our ability to do load testing. It enabled us to test larger and larger foundation elements, so most of the time pretty much full-size foundations, and that's certainly a great advantage. We don't have to try to make the extrapolation from smaller elements to larger elements as much. The third there is providing a direct measure of the tip resistance. If you do top-down tests, if you've interpreted those before, you know you have to make some considerable inferences and interpretations and assessments about stiffness and the modulus of the foundation element, which introduces uncertainty into the magnitude of the tip resistance at a particular time. Well, putting the load right at the tip of the shaft obviously negates or avoids having to do that, and that certainly provides us from that. And so by collecting all of this information, I really do think it's not an understatement at all to say that really dramatically improved our profession in many ways. And I don't want to talk about this too long, but I'll give you one example, and this is some work we did for the Missouri Department of Transportation about 10 years years ago, where MoDOT began using drilled shafts, I'll say about in the mid-90s, and understandably they kind of had a conservative design posture. But because of the increased testing that was afforded by bidirectional load testing, by the Osterberg cell, they were able to collect through a series of projects and then some research that they funded, a relatively large number of load tests, and combining those with load tests from surrounding states. And these are load tests in shaly materials, siltstones, mudstones, and the like. It allowed us in relatively short order to collect a large number of test results. So we could look at design practices. And at the time, and actually some people still use this, the method by Rowe and Armitage, which if you read their paper was admittedly a conservative method at the time. It was really theoretically based on some limited, in addition to some limited testing. Now with the advent of the O-cell and collecting more and more load test data, you can see that sort of plotted there. Not all of these data points actually achieved failure, and I'm looking at tip resistance at the moment. And so if we just isolate the tests that happen to achieve failure in tip resistance, you'll now sort of get a clearer picture about the conservatism that's inherent in that design method. So the data points that are circled in yellow there correspond to tests that actually achieve the ultimate tip resistance, or at least some tip resistance that we would be considered to be failure. And based on that analysis and looking at those data, MoDOT was able to adopt in 2010 a design method that was considerably less conservative than what they've been using in the past. Almost double in many cases the predicted values from the Rowe and Armitage method. I will point out actually the AASHTO code to this day still recommends using the Rowe and Armitage method. So there are some advances that we can still make. But this really wouldn't have been possible without bidirectional load testing. We just wouldn't have had the funding to be able to do that many tests and the capability to achieve those results. And so, again, I think it's kind of unquestionable the significant impact that bidirectional testing's had. There are some additional benefits, though, to bidirectional loading, and I'm going to kind of move away from the Osterberg cell, so to speak, and just now talk about other ways to do bidirectional loading. And so there'll be two more benefits, but the second benefit that we can get from bidirectional loading is actually improved performance. And so this is not about measuring the capacity or the performance of a foundation. This is actually about producing an improved performance of the foundation. And what I've got plotted here on the graph on the right there is results from 3 top-down load tests. These were performed at the Texas A&M experiment site with assistance from John Louis Briot at Texas A&M. The 3 top-down tests that are the load settlement curves for the 3 top-down tests there correspond to different magnitudes of bidirectional load that was applied prior to then subsequently performing the top-down load test. So if you look at the yellow curve, that corresponds to a conventional drilled shaft that was subjected to no bidirectional load before being top-down tested, and so that's really the reference value. If you look at the green curve, that corresponds to a shaft that was subjected to 120 kips of bidirectional load at the tip of the shaft prior to then subsequently coming back and top-down load testing. And so you see that the load settlement performance of the shown in the green curve is improved over that's shown in the yellow curve that wasn't subjected to the top-down load. The blue curve similarly corresponds to a shaft that was bidirectionally loaded, this time to 230 kips prior to then subsequently conducting a top-down load test. And what you see is that the performance there is even further improved. And so this is actually a mechanism for producing an improved load settlement response, really without changing the ultimate resistance. At large displacements, we're really getting the same or similar values at least. But at the intermediate loads, we're getting an improved performance, either in the form of having a greater resistance at a given displacement or having a lesser settlement at a given load. You can think about it in both of those ways. And so this is a mechanism for improving the performance of it due to that bidirectional load. Well, it turns out this is work that was funded by the Federal Highway Administration, which actually funded a group of folks under the guidance of the ADSC to study post-grouted drilled shafts and to really try to investigate how the techniques could be used to improve our practice. And I'll say that I think our key finding was really a surprise to most of us that were working on that team. And the key finding was that post-grouting is really less about ground improvement, trying to improve the ground beneath the tip of the shaft, and more about pre-mobilization or mobilizing load with a bidirectional load. And so the schematic drawing on the left kind of illustrates that. If you don't know about post-grouting, this is essentially constructing a drilled shaft much the same way we would a conventional shaft, but we're going to install one of various types of devices at the tip of the shaft. I've got 3 shown on the right that I'll talk about in just a second. Following placement of the concrete, allowing the concrete to harden, and we'll then come back and inject grout into that device with the intention of improving the performance of the drilled shaft to loading. One of the key benefits of that turns out to be this mobilization of load that's induced by the bidirectional load. And so we're going to mobilize downward or negative side resistance as the post-grouting is occurring, trying to push up on the shaft. At the same time, we're going to mobilize positive tip resistance as the device is really pushing on the ground down below the shaft. We can do this with a number of different devices, and I've shown you 3 here. The one on the top right is what we would call a sleeve port system, at least in the U.S., and this is a device that consists of a series of grouting tubes. On those grouting tubes at the base of the shaft, there's a tube à manchette grouting port, 1 or more of those in each of the circuits. We would consider those to be an open type grouting system where the grout actually goes down through the pipes, out the grouting ports, and in direct contact with the ground down beneath the tip of the shaft. The one in the middle on the right there is what we would call a flat jack. This is actually a device that was provided by Synchropile. But this is a similar device, but now it's got a membrane that's surrounding the bottom of the grouting tubes, and so it provides a closed grouting system, at least unless we accidentally burst that membrane. But essentially it's much like trying to blow up a balloon at the tip of the shaft, and again that's going to apply this bidirectional load. The third one on the bottom right is really not a post-grouting device, but it's a device that's intended to apply load in much a similar way, and that's the rim cell device from load test. This is actually gets cast within the concrete and then becomes a sealed device as well. And so the difference really in the one on the top right is it's an open device that allows the grout to be in direct contact with the ground. The middle and the bottom one on the right, at least intentionally, are not they're intended to be sealed and closed devices. And we'll see some consequences of that as we go along. Well, so why is it that applying this bidirectional load produces improvement in performance? And the concepts for this are really documented by Fleming out of the UK in the early 1990s. And I'm going to go through a couple of slides here that kind of illustrate the concept here. And these are simple conceptual representations of load settlement response. And so the graph on the left is just the top-down load settlement response, and this is considering a conventional shaft. The graph on the top right is a representation of the side resistance, and you'll note that you can mobilize both positive and negative side resistance depending on the direction that load's being applied. And then the graph on the bottom right represents a mobilization of tip resistance, and in that case it's only mobilized if we're pushing downward. If we're pulling the shaft upward, obviously we're not going to mobilize significant resistance at the shaft tip. If I consider different loads, and so the 3 symbols that are shown on the load settlement curve, the circular symbol, the square symbol, and the triangle symbol, represent conditions at different load levels. And those same symbols are used to represent the mobilization of resistance inside and tip resistance at those load levels on the graphs on the right. And so you see at a relatively low load level indicated by the circular symbol, we've mobilized a considerable amount of side resistance, a limited amount of tip resistance, and that's producing the ultimate response, or the response at that level. Considering a little bit higher load with the square symbol, now you'll see that we've fully mobilized side resistance, and this is generally true. We mobilize side resistance at relatively small displacements. We've fully mobilized side resistance. We've mobilized more tip resistance, but there still remains a considerable amount of tip resistance to be mobilized. Then looking at an even higher load corresponding to the triangular symbol, That corresponds to a condition where we fully mobilize both side and tip resistance, and that represents the ultimate resistance of that shaft. So if I now consider this with bidirectional loading prior to this top-down loading, essentially what this bidirectional loading is going to produce is an initial loading from which the top-down loading is then going to follow. And so whether this happens because of a post-grouting operation or because of putting in some other kind of device doesn't really matter. This is a mechanical thing, not really a device-specific thing. And so when we apply bidirectional loading, we're going to be pushing up on the shaft up above the tip, and we're going to be pushing down on the ground down below the tip, and that's going to pre-mobilize some resistance, negative side resistance in this case and positive tip resistance in this case. And essentially the idea is that that pre-mobilized resistance is going to influence the subsequent top-down loading. And so it's going to give us a new starting point from which we're going to begin top-down loading. We can even think about it as residual load if you wanted to consider it that way. And so essentially it's giving us a new starting point. So what I've shown here now is the top-down loading subsequent to that bidirectional loading. And you'll see that the dashed coordinate axes on the figures on the right represent the loading that was pre-mobilized prior to subsequent top-down loading. And on the load settlement curve on the left, you'll see that the dashed line corresponds to the conventional shaft, the solid line corresponds to a top-down load test after doing the bidirectional loading. And you'll see that you get this stiffer response, more resistance at a given settlement, less settlement at a given load, at least for the intermediate load levels, right? It's very similar at low load levels. It's the same at very high load levels. It's the intermediate load levels where we get the improved response. This is a purely mechanical thing. There's no ground improvement involved with this. This is really just about preloading and the benefit that you can get from that preloading. So I'll show you some experimental measurements that sort of confirm that concept, but an important piece here is that the degree of improvement that one gets is going to depend on the magnitude of that pre-mobilized load. The greater the load that you can pre-mobilize prior to the top-down testing, the better performance you're going to get in that subsequent top-down testing, which is a fantastic thing. So that tells you, okay, great, let's put a lot of load into the shaft. Well, that's great, and that certainly is an objective. But it's important to recognize that the magnitude of load that we can mobilize in a bidirectional sense is limited by the least of uplift resistance of the shaft, the tip resistance of the shaft, and potentially the device, depending on the specific device. And so we can only mobilize load to a level where we exceed one of those limits, and we need to keep that in mind. I think that's a place where, in practice, we sometimes get ourselves into trouble. So in addition to the testing we did at Texas A&M, more recently we were fortunate to be able to do some work for the California Department of Transportation, for Caltrans, to look at this a little further and a little bit more closely. We did a similar kind of a load testing program here where we tested one conventional shaft that wasn't bidirectionally loaded and then 3 other shafts that were bidirectionally loaded. So here the load settlement curve for shaft T1 represents the conventional shaft. The other 3 curves represent shafts that were bidirectionally loaded prior to the top-down loading, honestly to a very similar load for all 3 of those shafts. And again, you see that we get this improved performance, more load at a given settlement, less settlement at a given load for the shafts that were bidirectionally loaded prior to the top-down loading. We can look at the load transfer a little bit to kind of confirm this, and so I'm looking on 2 graphs here. The one on the left corresponds to the loads that were measured along the length of the shafts during bidirectional loading, during the post-grouting operation, and you'll see that we achieved a peak load at the tip of the shaft of on the order of 400 kips. Following post-grouting, that load did actually relax a little bit, and so you see it drop down considerably, especially down at the tip, a little bit less at the top. The load distributions that are shown on the graph on the right there represents the load transfer in the shaft during the top-down load testing compared to the reference conventional shaft. And what you find is that if you sort of start looking at the load transfer, and so taking, measuring the slope between these data points and inferring what the load transfer mechanisms are, it clearly illustrates this pre-mobilization concept that we kind of landed on with the FHWA work to do that. And so I'm going to show you a couple of these. This is the load transfer, so the unit side resistance in the lower portion of the shaft, shown by the yellow box on those graphs on the left. And so looking at that load transfer, you'll see during grouting, there's a mobilization of negative side resistance on the order of 1.5 KSF. Following grouting, there's some relaxation in that stress, and so we do lose some of that stress, but then with subsequent top-down loading, the curve that's shown in yellow with the yellow squares is the load transfer in that segment of the shaft during the top-down loading. The black curve corresponds to the same measurements made for the conventional shaft. And so the fact that you sort of get basically an overlap of that response suggests that this benefit that we're seeing is really a mechanical benefit. It's because of this pre-mobilized load that we've got. Looking at the load transfer in the center of the shaft, and so again, the blue curve there corresponds to the measurements for the post-grouted shaft. The black curve corresponds to the measurements for the conventional shaft. And again, we see mobilizing resistance during the post-grouting operation, essentially fully mobilizing the available side resistance there. Some relaxation following that grouting, and then subsequent top-down loading, we get a response that's quite similar to that. A similar thing at the top of the shaft. Obviously, in this case, we've got lesser ground conditions, and so we mobilize less resistance. The final one I'll show you here is really the mobilization of tip resistance, and I think this is one of the key questions that I had following the FHWA work is about this relaxation. What is that doing to the performance of the shaft that we see? And so what I've got plotted there on the right is the mobilized unit tip resistance. The dashed line corresponds to the mobilized unit tip resistance for the conventional shaft, so the one that wasn't bidirectionally loaded prior to the top-down test. The other lines correspond to the load transfer that was measured during grouting, following grouting, during a relaxation period, and then for subsequent top-down loading. And so if you look, the solid black line at the beginning of the load displacement curve there, you'll see it follows very closely along with that measured for the conventional shaft, right? We're just loading the bottom of the shaft just like we would for a conventional shaft. There certainly is some relaxation following grouting, and so we're losing a little more than 50% of the load that we mobilized during the grouting. But then with subsequent top-down loading, shown with the circular symbols there, you'll see that the load displacement response is now much stiffer than it was initially. And so essentially you can sort of think about this as we pre-mobilize, or we pre-consumed almost is 2 inches of displacement at the tip prior to doing the top-down load testing. And so obviously we're going to get a stiffer load settlement response with that. And so it turns out that this relaxation is something that I was quite worried about, that is probably not something we need to worry about very much, because if it relaxes, we get the improvement in tip resistance, or an improvement in the tip response. If it doesn't relax, we get the transfer to the side resistance. So to kind of summarize here about this pre-mobilization concept, I think it's pretty clear. We've done these two experimental studies to really kind of confirm that this is really one of the mechanisms that's producing it, and really the predominant mechanism that's doing it. With an open type grouting system, we can additionally get some ground improvement. So I'm not arguing that ground improvement can occur, only that this pre-mobilization of this load is really the predominant mechanism for the improved performance we see with post-grouted shafts. It's an improvement in performance without increasing the ultimate resistance. And I've underlined ultimate there because ultimate is not the nominal resistance that you get from most design calculations. That is the nominal resistance. That is a conservatively biased resistance. When we say ultimate here, I'm talking about the real ultimate resistance that we would get at very large displacements, something we don't get to measure very often, to be honest. In some ways, you can consider it to be a redistribution of available resistance. And so again, it's having this ground improvement. The most significant thing about this pre-mobilization concept, I think, is it's an independent of material type. This happens in sands, silts, clays, weak rock, strong rock, you name it. This is really about mechanics, not about some ground improvement that we're trying to do beneath the ground. It's pretty easy to predict. You can predict it with relatively simple TZ analyses. You can even predict it with simple hand calculations, kind of like the conceptual diagrams that I showed you earlier. The trick here is that the degree of improvement depends on how much load we can induce prior to top-down loading. The bigger the load, the better improvement we're going to get, and that's certainly the benefit. So I think, it's pretty clear at this point that this is a reliable thing, something that we can predict, something that we can count on. Unfortunately, it's a pretty difficult thing to try to implement, and Silas Nichols and I have had a number of conversations about how we can actually try to take advantage of this improvement. And it's tricky, not because the mechanics are difficult or unreliable, but it's tricky because of the way that our design methods have really been developed. Most of our empirical design methods are really displacement constrained, right? They're all, somebody's interpreting what the failure load is, either by some failure criteria or by the load that they achieved or other judgment on that part. And so we end up, when we talk about calculating drilled shaft capacity, that's not really the ultimate capacity. That's a number that we've used and have developed over time to use for our design, which is certainly a fine thing, but it makes it difficult to try to take advantage of this improved stiffness that we see from the bidirectional loading. So we can try to take advantage of that, and what I've summarized here, this is for the test that we performed in California. So T1 there, the kind of the first row of the table, represents the interpreted failure load for different failure criteria. So using the modified Davison criteria, criteria that's 5% of the shaft diameter and a criteria that's 10% of the shaft diameter. And so you get different failure loads for different failure criteria. The remaining three curves correspond to the interpreted failure load for the three shafts that were subjected to bidirectional loading prior to the top-down load testing. And I'll focus you kind of on the percent difference there. And what you'll see is, it varies depending on the failure criteria you pick. It varies a little bit depending from one test to the other. But we're talking about oftentimes on the range of 10 to 20 to maybe 30% improvement in that design capacity that we can count on just from this bidirectional loading, which is certainly nothing to sneeze at, but it's also not 50%. It's not 100%. It's not huge, and so it tends to be a thing that's a little bit difficult to take advantage of. Although one can certainly do that. So that's benefit number two. Again, an improved performance because of this bidirectional loading, and I think that's certainly beyond what maybe I don't know what Dr. Osterberg was thinking, but I think that's probably a little more than he was thinking. The third one is really, the third benefit is improved reliability. And this is really, in my mind, a combination of the first two benefits. And the idea here is, well, if we can go out and apply a bidirectional load with post-grouting devices or some other devices that are less reliable than a conventional bidirectional cell, but nevertheless applying some loading, well then, if we're applying load, then we're actually proofing the resistance of that specific foundation element to some level. And so one of the things we can try to do is, if we're going to do that, now if we're doing it a little bit more economically, that we can actually do that for every shaft. And so that really is a game changer in terms of the reliability. And so now, instead of going out and doing one load test, getting an estimate for what the side and tip resistance are and using that for the remaining foundations at a site, we can actually go out with one of these devices and actually proof load test every foundation element, much like we would do for ground anchors. Where we actually proof load everyone. And so there's been a lot of nice work on load tests and how we can use Bayesian techniques to try to estimate the reliability of a foundation based on load tests. The game changer here really is that now, if we can do this for every foundation element, that actually the Bayesian piece goes away. This is no longer a Bayesian thing. However, it's not just a simple matter, and fundamentally what a proof test does is it essentially cuts off the lower tail of our probability distribution for our foundation resistance. But if we're going to use post-grouting devices or other devices that aren't as reliable as, again, a conventional bidirectional cell here, we need to consider the fact that our proof load is not perfect. Our proof load is an imperfect measure of that, and it's got some level of reliability. So Shadi Najjar and Bob Gilbert out of the University of Texas actually have developed the kind of the math, the reliability calculations to do this, and we can use that with an uncertain proof load and we can use that to actually calibrate resistance factors. And so we did that as part of the Caltrans work, and the resistance factors are plotted there on the right. And I'll take just a minute to explain it so that it's clear, but there's the horizontal axis there is the normalized grouting force. And what that represents is the relative magnitude of bidirectional load you're applying compared to your predicted failure load. And so if I pick a normalized grouting force of 0.5, that means my proof load is half of what I think the real resistance is. If I pick a normalized load of 0.75, then I'm 3/4 of the way to that estimated resistance there. The vertical axis is resistance factor. The different curves there correspond to different assumed values of uncertainty in the proof load. So for 0, that would correspond to a perfect measurement of the proof load. Maybe we would consider that to be a conventional bidirectional cell that are commonly available today. For a coefficient of variation of 10%, that would correspond to a proof load where we had some uncertainty in the magnitude of that load on the order of 10%. The blue curve is a 20% coefficient of variation, and the green curve corresponds to a 30% coefficient of variation. And so you see the two dominant factors here in terms of reliability are, one, how reliable is your load that you're applying? How reliable is the bidirectional load that's really your proof load? And two, what's the magnitude of that bidirectional load? As you consider a more reliable load and a larger load, a higher magnitude, a load with higher magnitude, you can actually use higher and higher resistance factors to achieve the reliability that you're pursuing. And these were all calibrated for a probability of failure of about 1 in 1,500, pretty consistent with what the AASHTO code is. So the question then becomes, well, okay, so what's the uncertainty in my load, and what kind of load can I get? And so those are really the two fundamental questions that are needed to be able to implement this, and I'll show some examples in a little bit. So we're kind of developing these ideas about the time we were going to do the load test for Caltrans, and so we actually decided to actually post-grout all of our shafts, including our reaction shafts. So this is the load test site. It's just north of Sacramento in the Sacramento River Valley, just a couple of miles from the river there in the floodplain. Site consists of about 25 feet of silty clay soils overlying another 20 feet of sandy soils that vary a little bit in density to do that. The testing program here included 4 test shafts. Actually, one of the ironic pieces to this pre-mobilization piece is that you can't capture it with a bidirectional load test. So it's producing benefit from bidirectional loading, but to capture it, you actually have to come out and do top-down tests. And so we were doing top-down tests in this case, which means that we had to have reaction shafts. Well, we took advantage of having those reaction shafts by post-grouting those, by bidirectionally loading those to try to get some measure or some estimate for how reliable the load was from those different devices. And we considered, again, the 3 different devices: an open sleeve port device, a closed flat jack device, and then we had one of the rim cells for one of the reaction shafts. And so I'll show you those measurements. And so these are the measurements that we were really using to try to establish what's the uncertainty in the load that's being applied from these different devices. And so I'll start with the flat jack device first. And I'm showing you 4 different graphs. Those are graphs that are associated with different reaction shafts. So shaft 3, 5, 7, and 9 here. Each of the graphs, the horizontal axis is the measured grout pressure during post-grouting. So this is the grout pressure really measured at the grout plant. The vertical axis there is the measured force, and so this is really the force that was measured using strain gauges that were installed just above the grouting device and were monitored throughout the grouting process. And so what we're trying to look at here is how reliable is grout pressure, a measure of actually the force that was installed. The green lines that are shown there and labeled as theoretical, that's the theoretical relationship between grout pressure, assuming that it acts over the entire area of the device, and the force. And so what we would like, obviously, is for our measurements to sort of follow those theoretical curves. There's 2 lines in this case because there's a little bit of ambiguity between what the actual area of the device is, and so that's why those 2 lines are there. But that's a pretty small issue. And what you see here is for all 4 of these reaction shafts with the flat jack devices that there was was this nice linear relationship between the pressure applied and the force that was measured, which again is something that we were sort of desiring to see. If you look at the bottom two, you'll note that at the higher loads or higher grout pressures, around 1,000 kips, you do start to see that the relationship between grout pressure and force deviates a little bit from linear. Why that's happening is a subject of discussion and debate, but it certainly is just experimentally what we did observe. But a pretty decent relationship between these two, and actually as a result of these measurements, we sort of made a very conservative estimate and said, okay, the uncertainty in this load, if we're going to measure it using a flat jack device, is about a coefficient of variation of 0.15. We can argue about that a lot. This is certainly just based on tests that were performed at one site, so I think that number is probably considerably lower than that, but as a kind of a conservative starting point, we established that using considerable judgment. So this slide shows the same graphs, but now for the reaction shafts that were grouted using the open sleeve port devices. Okay, and so now this is the tube manchettes that are at the tip of the shaft. In this case, the area of the device is pretty clear, and so there's one theoretical relationship there. For all four of these shafts, you do see that at low grout pressures, low loads, there is a generally linear relationship between grout pressure and load. But at some point, and actually at a different point on each shaft, there's the proportionality between grout pressure and the measured force ceased to occur. For all four shafts, we mobilized very large grout pressures, approaching 900 to 1,000 psi, but much of that grout pressure, in fact, wasn't effective in producing load in the shaft. Okay, it may have been improving the ground, but it wasn't producing this load in the shaft. And so you'll see that there's not a great relationship here between pressure and load. And as a result, really, for these open sleeve port grouting devices, I think it's mandatory that we actually install strain gauges and have an independent measure of load. You can't use pressure as a good surrogate for the load that you're mobilizing. You need strain gauges to be able to do that. With strain gauges, if you've done interpretations of strain gauges before, you know that the stiffness of the concrete is a very tricky thing to deal with. And so because of that, if you're interpreting load from strain gauges and having to deal with the uncertainty and the modulus of the concrete, we assign that a coefficient of variation of 0.25. Conservatively, that's, again, we can argue about that number, and probably it can be a little bit lower, but we really assign that to the sleeve port devices. We used one rim cell device on a reaction shaft. We also had a test shaft with the rim cell devices. And remember this, so this rim cell is a proprietary device from load test that gets sealed up in the concrete of the shaft and then really uses that to apply this bidirectional load. You'll see that the data are scattered here, and I got to apologize a little bit for that. For logistical reasons, we used a grout plant that was appropriate for post-grouting to apply load using the rim cell, which would generally be using a much smaller pump. And so we were having a hard time with our vibrating wire instrumentation kind of keeping up with the sequence of loading. It happened all pretty fast. And so some of the scatter that you see there is really a result of the pump that we use, not so much really the device. But I think it's clear from both of them, if you can kind of look through the scatter a little bit, that in both cases here, there's a nice linear relationship that matches the theoretical one. I will say we cheated a little bit. There's an inference about the modulus here that we've made to sort of match it up. But the linear part is really something that we measured, and that's the key. And so based on these measurements and based on the fact that the rim cell is really a sealed up device within the concrete, we assigned it a coefficient of variation of 10%, just slightly less than what we would get with the rim cell. I still think, that's again from two shafts at one site. We need more measurements of this relationship here to be able to better define that uncertainty, but that's what we use to do that. And so if you put that all together, what we've recommended to Caltrans, just as a means for trying to implement these concepts, is this graph. And so the curves for resistance, so this is the graph of resistance factor versus the normalized force from this bidirectional force. 3 curves, one for the rim cell, one for the flat jack, and one for interpreting load from the strain gauges. Those correspond to the different uncertainties in the load, right? And again, I think those certainly are a subject of future work. You'll note that we cut off the resistance factors at a value of 0.5, or really whatever your nominal resistance factor that you would use for designing a conventional shaft, whatever method you're using, you would limit to that, and you would use those resistance factors. Interestingly, the same relationships apply for both side and tip resistance. This is just a simple probability calculation that's pretty straightforward. We're not reliant on any method for predicting side resistance or tip resistance. And so the relationships are the same for side and tip resistance, but we got to be careful here. The actual value of the resistance factor we would use may vary and differ for side and tip resistance depending on the conditions. And so the maximum force that we can mobilize is again limited by this side resistance or tip resistance or the device, and we need to keep that in mind. The normalized forces for side and tip resistance will generally vary. I'll show you a couple of quick examples here to kind of illustrate that. So just to give you some idea of the magnitude of benefit we can get from this premobilization, the example here is for a balanced shaft, and I'll tell you a balanced shaft is the ideal shaft. Having the same side and tip resistance means we can mobilize a greater magnitude of load and therefore count on higher and higher resistance factors for those loads. And so if we just define this conventionally, consider a conventional drilled shaft and the table on the top right, in this case I said side resistance is 2,000 kips, tip resistance is 2,000 kips, so our total nominal resistance is 4,000 kips. If we just say we're using a resistance factor of 0.5 to kind of average out something that we would commonly use, our factored resistance in this case turns out to be 1,000 kips in side resistance, 1,000 kips in tip resistance, and so a total factor resistance of 2,000 kips. If we now take the same shaft, with the only change being we're going to apply a bidirectional load before sort of putting it into service, before doing the top-down load. In this case, since it's a balanced shaft, the maximum bidirectional load we can apply is the least of side resistance or tip resistance, so that's 2,000 kips in this case. I'll get to the point of we're going to adopt this 70% target load, meaning we're not going to target going out to apply 2,000 kips because we might not get that for every shaft. We're going to reduce that a little bit to make sure that we can achieve that proof load. And so if we adopt that 70% target load, we can go from this graph, and so our normalized premobilization force would be the 0.7. We can go up, if we're using a rim cell, just to look at the optimistic case here, we would get a resistance factor of 0.72. We apply that to both side and tip resistance because they're the same in this case, and so we end up with, just by applying this bidirectional load, we get an improved factored resistance by about 45%. So now our factored resistance is 40% greater than it was before we did that, just because of the reliability benefit of the bidirectional loading. It's not always that good, so it can actually be, let me go back real quick, it could actually be better if we wanted to be a little risky and say, well, I want to try to get closer to that 2,000 kips, or maybe I think that 2,000 kips is a conservative estimate and I can go higher than that. Then you could get a little risky, and instead of using 0.7 for your normalized premobilization force, you could try to go to 0.8. But when you do that, you run the risk of potentially not being able to achieve that for every shaft. And so the beauty is we can use higher and higher resistance factors. The risk is I got to proof it when I get out to the field, and so I got to make sure that I can do that. So there's a risk-reward balance for the contractors and owners here that I think is pretty interesting. The second example I'll give you one is where the tip resistance controls, and so in this case the tip resistance is 330 kips, the side resistance is 820 kips, so I'm really limited by that tip resistance in this case. You'll see the factored resistance that I would get for a conventional shaft is about 575 kips. If I do the same thing, but now considering that I'm going to bidirectionally load this shaft prior to putting it in service, my bidirectional load now is limited to 330 kips, the least of the side and tip resistance, and so now I get a smaller load. I still get to use the high resistance factor for tip resistance because I'm going to really be fully testing that, if you will, or at least close to fully testing that. For side resistance, though, now the maximum load I can apply is limited by tip resistance, and so the normalized load for side resistance is much smaller. The resistance factor, I don't really get to take a benefit of that because the load's so small. And so I do get an improvement. I go from 575 kips to 650 kips, about a 15% improvement in the capacity. But just because I'm not balanced here, I don't get quite as much improvement. again, maybe here from really a 0 to a 50% improvement. If we're conservative with our target load, if we want to get a little bit more aggressive, we can actually get even greater benefits. So the last couple of slides that I'll show here before closing are about this reduced target load. Why on earth would I want to not maximize my resistance factor, right? If I'm estimating that the resistance is 2,000 kips, why wouldn't I try to target the 2,000 kips so I could use a resistance factor that's even higher? And really the reason why to do that is because if we go out to a site and we construct 100 drilled shafts, or for that matter, drive 100 piles or CFA piles, whatever foundation might happen to be, we're going to have some variability and uncertainty in that resistance, right? We can't construct a perfect foundation every time. And so we need to account for the fact that there's variability, even within a single site, in addition to uncertainty that's associated with we don't really know where our site is. And so we were kind of fortunate to collect some data for this work we did for MoDOT a decade or so ago to kind of look at this. And this is for side resistance, which I'll tell you is much more variable and uncertain than tip resistance, at least based on the information that we've collected. And so I've circled a series of data points that correspond to replicate test on a single site. So each of the ovals that are shown corresponds to the variability of the measured resistance for those sites. And what you'll notice is there's considerable variability, so that should worry you a little bit. But what you'll also notice is some of the ovals tend to be above the mean trend. Some of the ovals tend to be below the mean trend. Some of the ovals tend to be centered about the mean trend. And so some sites, you know, if I pick one of the ovals that's above the mean trend, I can be really aggressive and I'm going to work out great. I'm going to be able to achieve my target value with a high degree of reliability. Whereas if I happen to have a site that's below that, I'm not going to have such success. And so I would say this is one of the areas where research is really needed to better understand how much variability occurs within site, really either due to ground conditions varying from one spot to another, or due to construction practices that are varying things from one foundation to another, and how much of that's really due to uncertainty in our design method. So I think we can do a lot better than we have, but it requires some dedicated effort. This is just a plot of the observed within site variability for each of those sites, and there is some relationship with the site variability, with the variability of ground conditions, which suggests that it's really a site-specific thing. Although if you look at side resistance, you'll notice that there's an intercept there that suggests it's really affected by construction practices too. This is certainly a work in progress in trying to look at the magnitude of what that within site variability is. So the last one I'll show you is some really reliability analyses that Andy Bachman performed to try to look at what's the likelihood of this proof loading success. And so should I target 70% of my anticipated resistance, 80% of the anticipated resistance, 90% of the anticipated resistance, with the recognition that if I get too aggressive, I can use a much higher resistance factor, but I'm more likely to have problems and not be able to achieve the proof load during construction. And so this is for an unbiased design method, which is a little bit pessimistic. Most of our design methods have at least a little bit of bias in them, a little bit of conservative bias in them. I think that's particularly true for tip resistance, where even our best estimates of tip resistance, our best predictions of tip resistance are conservative because they're constrained by some failure criteria. We can actually mobilize considerable additional resistance and tip resistance for those. And so this is where the 70% comes from, and actually we've kind of had a little internal debate about should it be 70%, should it be 80%, but that's kind of the target value that we're landing on, at least based on what we've done so far. I think that's obviously an area for success. So in conclusion here, I'll just kind of restate the three benefits. Again, I think the first one is probably the one that we've realized most significantly, that the bidirectional test really has, for drilled shafts, I don't think we would be constructing 15-foot diameter drilled shafts that are 200 feet long if we hadn't had the bidirectional test to be able to confirm some things. Certainly, equipment advances have enabled us to do larger and larger and larger elements and to better understand construction practices and other things, but I don't think any of that would really have happened without the better understanding that we've got from doing bidirectional tests. I think it's clear at this point that bidirectional loading prior to top-down loading can actually significantly improve that load settlement response, give us, again, more resistance at a given settlement or less settlement at a given load. But it's a little tricky to implement with our current design methods. Serviceability seldom controls design for deep foundation elements, and mostly because of the way we've developed our practices. The third one is the most exciting one to me, is the potential to use this as a sort of a proof test, an imperfect proof test, but a proof test that will allow us to use greater and greater resistance factors, allow us to design more effectively, and really identify any problem foundations in the field. And the benefit of doing that is the ability to design more efficiently and cost effectively. So with that, I will say thank you and conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Eric. Are there questions for Professor Lohr? Anybody? You've covered everything so well. One of the things I noticed was just it seemed a couple of different pieces of terminology, particularly there at the end, is how with these great advances and these extra special efforts to improve these drilled shafts, what you're doing is trying to make them like driven piles. Dale did. You have like the concern of a residual load at the end of driving,
right.
How you've got locked in negative side resistance stresses that you have at the end of driving, just from the installation process, whether you're pushing it in or hitting it with a hammer, and just again right at the end of what do you have at the end? The similar reliability type things of what if I do have a problem in this one, how do I know? So it is something of a proof testing. It's imperfect, but it's going to make you sleep better at night and allow you to be a little more aggressive if you know you're pretty much there all the time.
Exactly, right? And so driven pile driving records, blow counts, right, are an imperfect measure of that pile's capacity, right? And so in very much the same way, I think it's a very similar thing. The residual stress, well, I shouldn't say all piles. Piles that are driven conventionally maybe are going to have that residual stress, and I think our empirical methods sort of inherently include that, and all the load tests that we've done include the effect of that residual stress, where with drilled shafts or other deep foundation elements that maybe those aren't so inherent in those practices.
Okay. Dale?
This question probably has no answer, but how much does that increase the cost of the drill shaft when you're post-grout?
That is a good question, and actually it does have an answer. You should ask a contractor. I think that's, I'm not one that's very able to answer that question, to be honest, but there is an incremental cost, and it's a great point actually. Is the benefit and efficiency you're getting from the design worth the cost? And I think that's really that value proposition is the one that we're sort of facing right now is okay, can I make it worthwhile? Yeah. And the devices aren't terribly expensive, but there's certainly a process that one has to go through to do this, right? You construct the shafts, you wait for the concrete to harden, you come back, you preload it, and then you move on. And so just like, it's just like any proofing mechanism, there's a time and a cost associated with it that we have to take into account.
It's certainly marginal in the sense that we tend to do it more for side resistance, or just like soil anchors. And so now if you're in a micropile or even an auger cast pile that you post-grout along the length, it's, I think of it in the 5 to 10% or something for small piles. For these, it's similar though. I mean, if you've got a full-length cage in the first place, you're just putting that flat
right,
jack on the
device.
bottom of your plate. So that's all already in there. It's a few tubes and some plates, and then the time it takes to mix up a batch of grout and pump it in there. So it's really, there isn't a real big cost, I don't think, if you can get back in there easily, if it's
right.
not some sort of weird offshore thing.
How long do you wait? You just wait for the concrete strength, the cylinders to get up?
Yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to wait till it gets full design strength, but it's a week, maybe it depends on the concrete, but a few days to a week, maybe a couple of weeks depending on it. But the bigger issue with the concrete is if you're trying to measure the load with strain gauges, you would like to wait until the modulus is sort of flattened out so that it's not changing very rapidly, and so that can have an impact. But I think just in terms of capacity and resistance, a few days to a week is probably plenty.
Well, thanks for the great presentation. The question is about the tip resistance. How you distinguish the enhancement in the ultimate tip resistance due to ground improvement from grouting versus for the mechanism?
Sorry, say one more. How do you distinguish the
The
tip
ultimate-
resistance that's coming from ground improvement compared to just the pre-mobilization? Is
Well,
that
I have to admit, I came here a little bit late. But
Okay.
I saw the graph, the ultimate tip resistance, with grouting or without grouting, right? But it was the same value. Why we did not see increase in that ultimate tip resistance due to ground improvement, not only to the mechanism?
Yeah, you know, it depends on the ground condition, it depends on the device you're using. So if it's a closed device and the device remains closed, then there's really no opportunity for ground improvement, and so you're just getting the benefit of the loading, right? If you're using an open type system, a sleeve port system, you can get ground improvement particularly in coarse grained soils, and that will produce, you're right, an increase in the ultimate resistance. The only way I know to identify how much of one is the other is either through some modeling to try to subtract out the part that's the mechanical part, or through side-by-side testing where you can have it in one and not have it in the other and do that. And so for the Caltrans one, if you look at the results for the sleeve port test, there is a minor improvement due to that ground improvement, maybe a 10% increase in the capacity. It's not a huge thing, but it certainly can occur.
Okay, well, thank you very much.